Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Today we'll be talking to Donald Antrim, author of his latest book, One Friday in April, a story of suicide and survival. It's a memoir, a nonfiction work that's being released as we speak today, October 12th. Donald's been a very frequent contributor to The New Yorker, and I've followed him through the years since my subscription to The New Yorker started more than half a century ago. And most of those stories, maybe all of them, were included in his book of stories, The Emerald Light in the Air. Donald is the author of Elect Mr. Robinson for a Better World, The Hundred Brothers, and The Verificationist, as well as another memoir about his mom, who also appears frequently in Friday. That book was The Afterlife. Oh, and also, I think, still scheduled is his virtual appearance at the Philadelphia Free Library, about half an hour from here, on October 21st at 7:30. And I think it's free, but I think if you pay $29, you get the book, the ticket, and a signed book plate. So it's clear, if you've read his earlier work, that the new one, this one, was informed by it, or perhaps it's the other way around. This book actually may have informed much of his previous work. So suicide is something that, especially in our time, is a topic that's really hard to escape. For example, in the past year, I have known 4 people, one of whom worked for me and was a 17-year-old young lady, who have killed themselves. I told this to a psychoanalyst, and he said, "So what else is new?" Which was really off-putting. One Friday in April posits a fascinating question about the idea of ending everything. Is the decision based on depression or anxiety or panic, or is suicide itself at times a lifelong condition, which may not be diagnosed as such in the DSM-5, but maybe a different way of looking at why we want to opt out of this universe for either nothing or perhaps another one where things may be different. Welcome, Donald, and thanks so much for joining us today.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
So since I own a bookstore, and even though it's supposedly not true, everyone judges the book by its cover. So your cover is interesting because it's essentially a mirror image of itself. And I wondered whether you vetted that, whether you came up with that, and actually the rationale behind that. I can kind of see it, but tell our readers about that.
I can kind of see it too. I didn't come up with it. It was one of the designers at Norton who did, and we all liked it. I guess it's could represent or symbolize the self in suicide and then in public, for instance, the way one seems as opposed to the way one is in sickness.
Yeah, that's something that I guess all of us, if we admit it, have inside of us. Either a voice or voices that tell us things that other people can't know. And then the epigraph from William Osler. Do you want to read that? Do you have that handy? Do you have the book handy so you can show it up?
I do. I do have one handy, as it turns out. Ask not what disease the person has, but rather what person the disease has.
In researching that, I was looking at his other quotes, and he also says, and this could apply to you, the person who takes medicine must recover twice, once from the disease and once from the medicine.
That's really true, yes.
So tell us why and how, because it really struck me. I've never thought about it before, how your definition of suicide, and even the subtitle makes it sound as if you might already be dead, how your definition of suicide differs from the one that we would normally assume to be true.
Well, I think that popularly, we think of suicide as a kind of an unfortunate accident or a consequence of depression, of disease. I came to this from a different perspective because I began to believe that the suicide wants to live and not die. And once we have that understanding, we can think in terms of a different kind of disease, one in which we're not in control of what's going on.
Well, and we can talk as we move along about how you felt when you were hanging from the fire escape, if you will. But what I went back to, like I said about reading your work, in the middle of a very successful literary career, you somehow kind of meandered, or you fell back into something, kind of in your own words, that had chased you all of your life. Why did it happen when you'd been so successful before?
Well, I think, and what I tell myself is it is because it happened because I wrote about my mother and felt that I'd violated a number of important taboos in doing so, that I'd betrayed her and that I'd betrayed myself. It was my first experience with memoir, and it didn't go well. And the writing was fine. The writing of it was exciting. I published pieces of it in the New Yorker as it went along, about 4, and then finished it after that. And
How
each
soon
time
after,
pardon?
I was going to say, how soon after you finished it did we come to the point where you were on the roof?
Well, a little less than a year. So it took a while to build up, but it was building up already during the time that I was publishing the separate pieces of it in the New Yorker. It took a little while, but it was I think of it as a kind of a triggering event. And it took me much longer, and after my first long hospitalization, to begin to think in terms of my own private or my personal history with my mother as a lifelong contributing factor, not only with my mother but with my whole family. I mean,
Yeah. Well,
you
that's,
know,
yeah. Talk a little bit about, I mean, obviously the memoir about your mom, it's funny, you wrote a memoir because you wrote a memoir. Talk about the rest of your family, because everyone's kind of, I mean, all families are dysfunctional in different ways, but yours is pretty dysfunctional.
well, my parents were pretty fiendish alcoholics. I mean, they were strong alcoholics. So from early on in life, my sister and I lived in a world of fighting. So my parents would fight every night until 2 or 3 or 4 in the morning, almost every night during growing up. And that's a bit of a shock right there. I used to run out into their fights and try to stop them. My sister retreated back into her room. So we had very different coping strategies. She and I are friends now, but for a long time, our family life drove us apart. We were highly out of touch, as it were.
When I first started college, this neoliberal college, actually the only university in the country that would take me, our first year
I know
was,
the feeling.
they only graduated me from high school just to get rid of me. I don't think I ever had enough credits. Um, but our first year's curriculum, because it was like Goddard or Franconia, the curriculum for everything was nature versus nurture. And nurture seems to be the driving force here. But how do you feel about nature, about genetic predisposition to these types of situations?
I don't know the answer. You
No,
know,
no, yeah.
I don't know the answer. I don't think we really know. I don't think medicine really knows the answer to that for suicide.
I just saw the other day, I was in New York, and now that Broadway's open, I saw American Utopia with David Byrne, who I love. And he said something at the outset. He's holding this brain, and he says that infants have 100 billion neurons when they're born, which is twice as many as adults, in a brain that's half the size. And that's why I asked that question, because it's like idea of the Buddha baby, and there you are, this tabula rasa, and then what got imprinted on you, for the most part, wasn't that great.
No, it wasn't. I guess when I think about nature versus nurture, I think that they're fundamentally the same in some way.
Yeah, I can see that.
You know?
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, I don't, and like you just said, we don't know. We don't know the answer to that. I mean,
Right.
I've interviewed lots of authors who've written about consciousness. Oh, that was a question I was going to ask you. I get them mad because I ask them I always ask them, what if it was a solipsistic universe? And they get mad because that screws up their entire theory of consciousness. And there was a point in the book where you kind of touched on that, that maybe it was just you, alone on this endless strand, this endless beach, and there's nothing else but just you.
You mean when I'm sick?
Yeah.
Yeah. My sense of that was that time took on a different kind of gravity or weight, that time changed. I felt that I was in a sort of an eternity. I was, for a long time, I would try to sleep and not be able to, but in the hopes that in the morning it would all change, that it would all be different, that I would be back to normal. But that never happened. It got worse and worse and worse. And I began to believe that I would never escape the illness, that this was it. That informed my thinking about all this, was the way in which, in the state of suicide, life becomes a kind of eternity, or the condition becomes an eternity outside of historical time.
So to be certain, so the reader is certain, suicide is not an act that you commit. Suicide is a condition that you suffer from theoretically all your life.
That's one way of putting it. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
So I think I can't remember. Did you touch upon the Cartesian duality in the book? You did,
A
didn't
little
you?
bit.
Yeah. How did the mind body, well, that goes back to nature versus nurture. Well, no, it doesn't. But how does the mind body concept, how did that play into, I mean, you're an intelligent, articulate person, so that must have played into some of your normal psyche and also the delusional one.
I was physically sick. When I was in the hospital, I was so sick that I believed that I was in the wrong hospital. I believed that I was being held captive by my doctors, by my psychiatrists, who didn't understand that my real illness was in my body, that I should be in a different hospital, a general hospital. I had constant tingling in my extremities. I had a feeling that my chest was compressed, that there was a great weight on it. I was in a state of a kind of shock. Now I was medicated, and I was calm some of that time, but I was sicker and sicker. And I mean, at several points, I demanded that the internist come over from Columbia to the New York State Psychiatric Institute, where I was in residence for almost 4 months,
Yeah.
and check me out. And he would check me out and tell me that I was fine, that I didn't have any physical maladies, and then I would feel better for a few minutes. And then after I left the office, the medical checkup office, it would all return. And I was weaving down the halls. I couldn't walk straight. So
Yeah.
my balance was off. Pardon?
One of the most striking examples of that was when you kind of felt like your shoulders were kind of like dislocated.
Right.
And you had a confrontation with a bunch of people, and they seemed to be taken aback, almost afraid of you.
Well, I must have looked pretty bad to them. And at that point, that was only about a week and a half or 2 weeks before I went to the hospital, maybe even less. I was hospitalized after my trip to the roof, which was where the title comes from, one Friday in April. And then talked my way out after just a weekend. And then 5 weeks later, I was so sick that I went back into the hospital. But before that happened, before I went uptown to stay for a long time, I had this episode with my shoulders. They felt like they were rotating oddly in the sockets, and that they would come out of my, that they would fall out. And I took myself up to an orthopedic clinic on the Upper East Side, where I think I must have scared people. I was dizzy, I was wild-eyed, I was wearing clothes that must have seemed to be a couple of sizes too big because I'd lost so much weight. They could see it. They could see that I wasn't well. But I was there at that point. I was definitely in the wrong doctor's office.
Yeah, and everyone kind of said, "Hey, you're fine." What about the people who read this book who may think, you know what? Why didn't he just do it? You know, why is he telling us all this stuff? Why didn't he just let go? And you kind of say because you didn't want to die. You
No, I
wanted
didn't want to die. I was just up there. I found myself on the fire escape, or I ran up and ran to the fire escape and climbed a few steps down and then hung off of it.
Yeah, but your hands were raw. You were in your socks and you were hanging, and then you'd kind of like, well, it's hard for me to understand why you didn't at that moment, just at some moment. And that you even say on the way down, if you let go on the way down, you might go, oh shit, why did I do this?
Right.
But it's just, what is it? What is that little thingy that makes you stay on? What is that little thing that doesn't allow you to let go, even though you're very, very close to it?
Well, I didn't want to die, and I stayed up there on the fire escape for a long time. And after some amount of time, I got up, I climbed back up and got onto the roof itself, where I crawled around and roamed around and looked over the various edges. And I wouldn't get too close to the edge because I was afraid of heights. I'm afraid of heights. So I think I just stayed long enough for the moment to pass. I I knew when I was on the roof that if I were to come down, I would wind up in the hospital, and I was terrified of the hospital. I thought that I would be put away forever, that I would never get out, or at least that it would take years to recover. And it took me about 5 hours to come down from the roof. It went from day to night. And when I came down, my girlfriend and a couple of other friends were waiting in the apartment, and they just swept me off, took me in a car to the hospital for my first short visit.
Yeah, that
But
reminds me. You had a really good, loyal, because I might have abandoned you, support group of friends.
right, I
Really,
did.
and your girlfriend, Reagan.
Reagan.
Uh, yeah, I mean, they really hung, and you weren't that great to her in a lot of ways.
No, I wasn't. I was very sick at that time, and I wasn't. I was quite out of my mind, really. But going back to your question about what enabled me to survive, I don't know the answer to that either. I don't really know. I thought that I should live. I thought that I should give it a try. But that took a long time to come to on the roof. I mean, it seemed, again, things seem eternal in that illness. And that seemed like an eternity that I was on the roof.
Well,
And when I finally came back down the stairs, I was full of dread. I didn't want to face what was coming.
yeah, that's why I'm saying, well, why don't you just let go? All the dread would go away, everything would go away. That's where I'm a little confused, because it's obviously you're hanging there. It's totally pivotal, not only to your life, but to this work. So you're hanging there, you're almost letting go, but you want to live. And it almost seems like the juxtaposition is impossible or improbable. I don't mean to push you too hard on this, but still.
I almost did let go, and I could have let go. It
Right.
was it was very close.
But
What? Pardon?
there never was this feeling that I would rather there be nothing or whatever comes after than what I'm going through now. Because as you keep saying, you were very, very sick and full of dread.
There was that feeling. I did have that feeling, and I flirted with it. I kept letting go with one hand, and then
Yeah.
I found that I would catch myself. I was leaning out over it, hanging from the railing, and I would catch myself with the hand that let go, usually my left hand. And maybe that was how I wound up coming back up the ladder to the roof. I didn't do it after a certain amount of time. And so I came back up to consider. I couldn't really consider much. I couldn't really think about it very much. But I came back up to wait a minute before I did it. I was afraid. I was afraid to fall, and I was afraid not to. It's a terrible predicament. And somebody else might not make it. I did. I made it back up, and I made it to the hospital for that first trip. I kept taking care. I kept, when I went to, I took myself to the hospital the second time, the long hospitalization. Why did I do that? So I was even sicker by then. I couldn't function at all. I was sleep deprived. I was dizzy. I hurt everywhere.
What's the book that you talk about that I've read, but I forgot the title, by William Styron?
Darkness Visible.
Yeah. And that's where I first understood, I think, and you use it as a gnomon of understanding. That's where I first understood the concept of suicide not being the act. And I don't know if that's something that if it's derivative or seminal on your part in this book. Is it? Did you come up with it, do you think?
Well, I think I came up with it in my own terms through my own experience, but I owe a debt to Darkness Visible. Absolutely.
Yeah. When I read, I realized, well, one, how much it affected other people, and two, how it wasn't. He was trying to explain, well, it's not just being depressed. It's something way, way different than that. Oh, yeah, which reminds me, why did you go through that semi-Joycean litany of, for want of a better term, the blues, a page of what this is called? What were you trying to tell us?
Just trying to drive it in, how many different ways we have of describing it, how many different terms, where they come from, how different they are in reality, but how we interchange them. Just making a larger point about it instead of simply saying we have a lot of ways of talking about suicide. It seemed to me that it would be good to elaborate on that, or to enumerate some of the ways.
It was good. It gave a lot of perspective, I believe. Let's move on to what's kind of an integral part of the whole book, which is your various medications. I'm not asking for a litany of those, but a summary of what they were, how they worked, what didn't work, because that's one of the things that I think the reader can take away from this, especially readers who find themselves essentially calling you as a suicide hotline.
Well, during that time, during that early period, I had tried a variety of medications, but I was resistant to them. So I was taking Klonopin, benzodiazepine, for anxiety. And that was making things worse, much as Halcyon made things worse for William Styron. So I wasn't medicated. I wasn't really medicated. I was on the one anti-anxiety medication, but I wasn't medicated on antidepressants. Now I am. Time has passed. And I was after the hospital, after ECT, I was medicated on lithium and nortriptyline, which is an older generation antidepressant.
Yeah, both are. Yeah, that's well, that goes into the stigmatized concept of electroconvulsive therapy, which
Right.
everyone is repelled by because it's shock therapy, and like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and what happens to Jack Nicholson.
Exactly.
Yeah, so talk about why that, if you think that it actually was helpful. It was at one time.
ECT
Yeah.
saved my life.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh,
It saved my life. And I
well,
think it's a very strong measure against suicide. I was terrified of it. I saw it coming. And I thought that I would lose everything. I thought that I would lose my writing. I thought that I would lose my ability to think. I thought that I would lose my ability to function. I was very bought into that idea, that older idea about the dangers of ECT and shock therapy. And I went into it. I proceeded with it with tears. You know, I didn't believe that I would be okay at all. And in that first trip to the hospital, I had about 18 rounds of it. So about 9 or 10 rounds and nothing happened. And then about 8 more. And then it took hold. And I began to walk straight, and I began to be able to hold my head up. And my voice changed. It got deeper, and I had more resonance in my more body in the sound coming from my chest. But it saved my life.
There were three interesting things about that scene, if you will. One, the woman who came in, the doctor who came in and was dressed in the business suit and seemed very professional, was very self-assured. And secondly was when you peeled, you know how they moisturize and you peeled that off. That was made it really real. And the third thing, which is the saddest for me, is the fact that David Foster Wallace called you up and talked to you about it and said, do it. And then, of course, he stops taking his Nardil, and he's the one who actually does kill himself.
Yes, that's right. At the end of a long drug trial, a nortriptyline trial, nortriptyline by itself, with a little Seroquel thrown in for anxiety, the doctors took me into a meeting, and the chief ECT doctor said to me that I was very sick, that I was psychotic, and I